Hey everybody, it is 11 o'clock, so welcome to getting up and running with CSS Grid. My video seems to have paused, but let's figure that out and get that fixed before we move on. You see a nice picture of me, which is always fun for starting things off. Let me refresh that device and we will get it up and running. All right. So we should have a decent video coming in now. We're gonna mostly be streaming my screen today, but if you're just tuning in, I got a couple people who shouted out in the chat. Shout out and let me know where you're tuning in from. I'm curious to find out how far this has reached into the wide world. Also, make sure you can see I've got a cat here. She's notorious for unplugging my mic. So if at any point my audio gets a little jumbled, be sure to let me know. I can plug that back in, no problem. So this is an experiment in seeing if this kind of 1 hour low cost lunch and learn style video is something that people are wanting. So I'm kind of not desperate for feedback, but I would love to get your feedback afterward. You can leave it as a chat message here. You could go into the course page and leave a comment on one of those pages. Hit me up an email, brian@codecontemporary.com. Find me on Twitter @brob, as probably most of you are. That's how you found it. But I'm very, very curious to see what you thought of it. Did you get $3 worth of value out of it? That kind of thing. So let me know later on. Hey, we got 2 Texans. Cool. 2 people in Tennessee and 2 people in Texas. Cool. So yeah, so let me know how this goes. If you do have any questions along the way about the things that we're talking about, be sure to put them in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on it on my second monitor, so I'll be answering questions along the way. Or at the end, we'll do a question and answer session as well. And hopefully we can get through any questions that you've got in that way. So on the course page and also in the description of this video, I posted a link to a series of code pens. That's going to house the actual HTML markup that we're going to be starting with to cover Grid today. There are 3 code pens. We're going to do one that's going to create kind of a basic grid pattern, number of items side by side, kind of a traditional web design component. We're going to be doing an asymmetric grid, which is going to highlight some of the more advanced features like named grid areas. And then we're going to talk about doing a blog article post where we can have a breakout area in the middle of it without having to adjust our markup, which I think is very, very important and is something that Grid can be very powerful with. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. That's the order that we're going to go in. Let me go into my screen share mode. I'm using Firefox. It is one of the better browsers to debug and play with Grid inside of. But you can see I've got the CSS Grid webinar. Yeah, Joe, I know that you've got a couple cats. Hopefully one's watching with you too. We're going to start with the basic CSS Grid fluid grid down here. And yeah, we're going to be using place kittens along the way for this one. So buckle up, plenty of cats along the way. Let's get rid of that JavaScript panel and let's make our CSS panel. So I want to start by looking at our markup a little bit. We have a parent element, which we're calling article grid, div class article grid. And then inside of that, we're going to have multiple articles. So this is just going to be kind of a standard promo grid for a blog or for a marketing site, something like that. Just getting a few things side by side and having them stack. We can very easily do this in floats. We've been doing it in floats for a long time. There are a lot of little hacks that go into that. We could do it a little bit more easily with Flex, but Flex, we'd have to bring in a whole bunch of media queries to make them work responsibly. We're going to use Grid. It's going to allow us to do a breakpointless, a media query-less responsive grid, which I think is really, really cool, but it's also going to showcase a few of the properties that we need to deal with. So out of curiosity, while I'm getting this prepped up, leave a chat message and let me know, have you used Grid in production yet? Have you used Grid in your personal projects? Are you familiar with the basics, or is this going to be more of a from the ground up kind of experience for you? All right, so we talked about the HTML, the markup that we've got here. We've got multiple articles. We've got div class article grid. So let's go ahead and bring our article grid into our CSS. So class article grid. And I'm going to put an article class here. And the fun thing is we're not going to use it at all. I just like to illustrate the point that all the things that we're going to be doing are going to happen on the parent in this exercise. And that's because grid works from a layout definition in, whereas flex and floats traditionally have worked from the content's size out. So you would say each article would be 33% if you wanted a 1/3 grid. You'd have to go and specify a width or a flex basis on your articles to make that happen. Grid, everything that we're going to do is going to be on that parent, on that actual grid definition. So inside of article grid, the very first thing we need to do is switch from a block level context, which is what article grid currently is. Most divs come as a block level element. We need to change this display value from block over to grid. So if you're familiar with Flexbox, you would do a flex container as display flex. In grid, it's much the same way. We're going to change it from display block to display grid. And as we save that in, you'll notice not a whole lot's happening on the left-hand side. And that's because grid by default is going to give you one column. So it's very, very much until you specify columns and or rows, nothing is going to change. It does some small things around margins, but nothing that you need to worry about, at least in the basic arena that we're talking about today. So once we have this in a grid context, we need to go in and we need to add this into a grid column definition. So there's a whole bunch of new properties in CSS for CSS Grid. The most basic way of setting up a grid are going to be set up display grid and then use grid template columns to set up the columns of your grid. So I'm going to do that down here. I've got a cat fight under my desk. Good stuff. Grid template columns is the CSS property we're going to use here. All those dashes are very important, and it's columns plural, not columns singular. And then it's going to take a number of values, and those values are separated by spaces, and that's going to create the number and the size of the columns all at the same time. So if I want 3 columns that are 300 pixels wide, I would do a syntax like this: 300 pixels, space, 300 pixels, space, 300 pixels. And as you can see here, we get 3 300 pixel wide areas. You can see my last one is breaking out a little bit, and that's actually not the column breaking out, it's our images. So I'm just going to do a quick max width on our image tags just to make sure they don't break outside of our columns. And that's just kind of typical reset in your CSS for images. Images always want to be their aspect ratio, to be the size that they were imported in at. And so by setting a max width of 100%, it makes sure that the image can never extend outside of its container. Just a nice non-grid CSS tip for you there. So you can see here, we now have 3 columns. They are not flexible, they are not fluid, they are not responsive. They are purely what we told grid to do. 3 columns that are 300 pixels wide. And don't forget your semicolons at the end, that can always bite you later on. So I could very easily come in here, and if I want these to have percentage-based widths, I could use any CSS length value I wanted. So if we want to do 30% columns, we could do that. 30% of the parent, that gets us roughly a third across. But that doesn't get us much better than, say, what flex would get us if we were using flex basis or a width set on our articles. That's just a different kind of syntax that we get the same thing out of. And we still have to worry about our margins. We still have to worry about adding gaps in there and doing the calculation to make sure that we never have anything that breaks outside of our container. So in the grid specification, we have a new unit as well, a new length unit. It's called the FR unit. It stands for the fractional white space inside of our grid, inside of our parent element. And so if I come in here and I give these 1 FR for each of their units, 1 FR, what we get is equally sized columns that are going to be able to have our internal margins be subtracted from them. This is 1 unit of a fraction of the available white space. So it's not all the space of the container like a percentage would be. It is only the available space in the container. So if I were to have 1 hard value in here, 1 absolute value, 500 pixels, those 2 1FR units after that are going to only divvy up the additional space in our browser. So that 500 pixel wide one will always be 500 pixels, but the other ones will shrink as far as they can based on their content. But we want this to be fully fluid, so we'll do 1FR here. And that gets us 3 columns, equally sized, and automatically Grid is going to add rows in the browser to accommodate more and more markup. So no matter how many articles we have, we'll always have 3 columns and the rows will just keep extending. So I just want to make sure everyone's kind of following so far. So give me a thumbs up or a heck yeah in the chat, and let me know if things are going well for you thus far. Nope, we got a cat back. All right, so this works out well, but I'm not a fan of my elements bumping up against each other, right? We have this space in here. I could go in and on our articles add a margin on the right of each of them, right? That would be the traditional way we would handle this in CSS, floats or flex space, right? We would say margin right, 1 rem, and then every third element we would clear that margin right. We would do an nth child selector and we'd be good to go. But that's always felt a little bit like tricky, right? That's always felt like you're having to work around the way CSS works. And so in the grid specification, we have a new property called grid gap, grid-gap, and that represents the column gap and the row gap. So that's going to actually add space inside of our grid, inside and not outside. So no matter how many items you have, no matter how many columns you have or rows, it's only going to add the space in between the columns and in between the rows. So that means that we don't have to worry about clearing margins, top, bottom, left, right, whatever. We don't have to worry about that. So we're going to specify a grid gap. It takes 1 or 2 values. One value is going to be both the row and the column gap, and 2 values would be the row and the column gap. For the most part, I tend to find that symmetric gaps are best, and so I tend to just kind of go with 1 gap value. So we have 1.5 rem, and we have that value subtracted from our available white space, and the 1FR unit keeps it in thirds. So I'm going to go on a quick tangent, and we're going to open this up in full page mode in CodePen. And I'm going to show you the reason that I use Firefox for any time I'm doing layout work. And that's because they have probably the best layout tools on the market. You can see here they have a way of displaying grids on the page, and Chrome has it in their DevTools, and it's okay. But I just kind of prefer the way that Firefox shows it. And you can see it shows me my line numbers, which we're going to get into in our next example. It shows us the gap pulling in here. I can leave that overlay on there. I can extend my grid lines indefinitely on the page, so I could maybe see how one grid interacts with the other. I can also change the color of these. So if my background were purple, I could change it over to white, and I would be able to see that on a dark background or vice versa. So just something to keep in mind as you're playing with it. You can also see your grid declaration down here, see how things are spacing out. It's just super handy, and I just like the way it flows, and they've spent a lot of time working on it. And so I love the way the grid works in Firefox and the inspector tools here. So this works, right? This is a 1/3 grid, 3 items side by side. They take up the full width of our container, no matter what that container size is. But it is not great responsively, right? It's fine going up. It's fine to about like a tablet size. But once we get down, they get quite squishy. And so this would be traditionally in Flex or in Floats where we'd go and add a breakpoint, right? Media, max width, 640 pixels, or whatever values you're using there. You would add that in, and then maybe set your columns to be 2 columns, and then at a small mobile size, set your columns to be 1 column. That's kind of the way we did it in Flex. That's the way we did it in Floats. We don't have to worry about that in Grid because we have some advanced properties that we're going to get into right now. So instead of 3 columns that are 1FR and this declaration doing it over and over again, I'm going to use a new function in CSS. And out of curiosity, did you know that CSS had functions? If you did, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, give me a mind blown in the chat. But CSS has functions. There are a few different types of them. The one we're going to use today, there are 2 that we're going to get into, and they are both specific to Grid currently, although there is talk about moving them to other properties as well. But inside of our Grid template columns, I'm going to use a repeat function. And what the repeat function is going to do is it's going to take 2 arguments. The first one is going to be the number of times to repeat the value that is the second argument. So in this case, we want to start off just by replicating our original design, and we're going to say repeat parentheses 3, 1FR. And that will get us 3 columns of 1FR. It's going to repeat that value 3 times. Theoretically, you can use the repeat function and continue having other columns defined out. Over here, you can have one that's maybe like 500 pixels next to it or 200 pixels next to it. And then the repeat value just works in that one area. For what we're doing today, we're mostly just going to focus on one set of repeats for this. Cool, cool. So the next thing that we need to do is not use these kind of hard-coded values for our columns. So the first thing we're going to do is replace our FR unit here, our 1FR, which is a nice fluid unit, but we're going to replace it with another function in CSS. This function is the min-max function, and it's going to take 2 arguments. I would let you guess if we were in person, but the delay would kill me in this case. The min-max takes 2 arguments. The first one is the minimum size. The second one is the maximum size. So this is going to allow for our grid algorithm to take control in a second, but I'm going to specify the values. I'm going to say I want my minimum value to be around 300 pixels, something decent mobile sized, and my maximum size to be that 1FR. So we're going to save that in, and you can see we don't quite have what we want going on here. And that's because I've told it to always be 3 across, right? Always, always, always be 3 columns. But I want the browser to take control. I want to take my hands off the wheel and let the browser like take care of its own business. So instead of 3, instead of specifying the number of columns, I'm going to give one of 2 keywords to the browser in this declaration. It's either autofit or autofill, and there are some articles about it, but the differences are pretty minimal. So autofit is going to say fit as many elements in a column, in the columns, as many columns in our grid as will fit with this declaration over here. So that's going to say, all right, we have 300 pixel at a minimum for each of these. So when my browser is roughly 900-ish pixels wide, I can fit 3 columns of 300 pixels. But if the browser shrinks to a point where I can't support 300 pixels in 3 columns, shrink to 2 columns and use that maximum size to expand out those areas to fill up the space. And you can see when we get down to a mobile-ish size, we go down. And if we were to get up to a big enough size, we go into 4 across. Now, this might be a point where you would want to maybe have a large screen breakpoint, because when you get 5 across, we get into like some weird areas in terms of the actual layout. So you could have a breakpoint that would specify at a maximum size have 4 1FR columns, or at a minimum size have 4 1FR columns. Or we can use kind of the centering concept in CSS to take care of this for us. And on our article grid, we could set a max width of, let's say, 1260 pixels. We'll make up a value as we go. And then have our margin left and our margin right. Cat's trying to type. Our margin left be auto and our margin right be auto as well. So what this will do, and we'll go into full screen mode to take a look at that, is at a certain size, we'll make sure that our browser can never go above that size for our articles. So it's still a clean look. It's no longer full width, but we don't necessarily want it to be full width at a large browser size. So this is kind of using there's actually a great online book and resource called everylayout.dev by a guy named Andy Bell and Hayden Pickering over in England. They call these design principles, and one of them is the grid and one of them is centering. So it's kind of a mix and match of those 2 together. And I really like the way they think about design. So this is in, how many lines of code are we? Delete that. 9 lines of code, we have a grid that is fully functioning, fully fluid, fully responsive with no breakpoints. So I like to think this is kind of my entry point for most people into grid. Most people see this and say, wow, that's pretty cool. So I'm hoping that's kind of where you got, but it also shows a few of our different properties, a few of our different values that are coming in that we're going to use more extensively in the next 2 exercises. So I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to ask any questions before we move into the next example, into exercise 2. I'll let y'all catch up with that as we go. I do love a good delay in broadcast. It's always good. Let me shrink and grow this a few different times so we can see that in action. So what we talked about was display grid, sets our grid context, Grid template columns, we can set a number of values, and that corresponds to the number of columns and the size of each of those columns. We set a gap that is a universal gap internal to the grid, not pushing things out. This is not margins. It does not continue infinitely into whatever direction is going. And then just for cleanliness in our design, we decided to make this a centered column that had our grid contained at a maximum size of 1260 pixels. You could also extend that and have it be bigger if you wanted to accommodate 4 rows, or smaller if you wanted a different style on that as well. So that was maybe too big, but just things that you can play around with as you're going through this. So we'll save that in. I'm going to go ahead and head on back to the collection of CodePens. And we're going to go into the next one, which is going to be our asymmetric promo grid. And we're going to start in a very odd place for this. Our markup is just anchors. And this is a pattern that's going to allow us to have asymmetry baked in without having to do all sorts of weird clears, floats, heights, all sorts of weird stuff that we would normally do in a flex-based layout. So we have a section, class banner. This is kind of a traditional homepage banner, page banner kind of scenario. And then we want to have space for 4 different promos, but we're going to have one promo take up 50% of the right-hand side. And then the other 3 will live in kind of a little spiral on the left-hand side, getting progressively smaller. And we're going to use this as an example of how we can actually span columns and span rows in our grid, which is something that's not been particularly easy in the past in CSS. So again, we're going to move into our CSS, and we're going to have a class of banner. And this is where we're going to do the brunt of our work, but we are going to apply some stuff to our promos as well. But to start with, we have to declare this to be a grid context, a grid level item. And so we're going to say display grid again. And then I want to specify the number of columns I want. You can actually see we did have something big change on the left-hand side of this one when we said display grid. Anchor tags are by default inline elements, but in grid they become grid items, which means they're kind of, not in the technical sense, but in a analogous sense, they're now block level items. So they do change their own context based on their parent in this case. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our asymmetry in our grid declaration. So if I were to have a 50-50 split and have something take up 2 columns on the left, 2 columns on the right, and then have 2 things take up 1 column on the right, I would have to, in like an old school methodology, in a bootstrap methodology, I would say that each of those elements, one would take up 6 columns, and then 2 of those smaller ones would take up 3 columns each. I basically have to play with that sizing, with those declarations. But in grid, I can bake into my declaration the actual asymmetry of the layout that I want, because we're working from a layout context in. So we're going to use that same value, that same property, grid template columns. And now we're going to specify 3 units. I'm going to set up 3 columns to accomplish the asymmetric area that I want. I want my left-hand side, that 1 column on the left-hand side, to take up twice as much room as 2 columns on the right-hand side. And that's going to allow for us to put some asymmetric promos in. So we're going to say 2FR space 1FR, 1FR. And you can see here automatically these grid items are starting to flow into those areas on the page. So if we take a look at it again, you can see, let's actually go in and open this in a full page, and let's examine that grid in our inspector tools real fast. So, because it's CodePen, I got to inspect the page to get there, section banner, and you can see, let me change that color, that's not great. Let's change it to a black. You can see here we have the left-hand side extends to about the middle of the page, and then the 2 areas on the right-hand side. And then by default, our 4th item, there are only 3 columns, breaks onto a 2nd row. You can see how that flows. You can see down here the declaration, it gets pretty wide, but for all intents and purposes, we are at 2 times the size on the left-hand side as we are on the right-hand side. So again, this Firefox Inspector tool is great for actually visualizing what you've done on the page. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to have our rows defined out as well. Because in Grid, we can define out our rows as well as our columns. So I'm going to come in and we're going to say, all right, we want a set of template rows as well. Grid template rows. In this case, we want 2 rows because we're only going to ever have 2 rows in this design. And I'm going to specify that min-max for both of them because I want them to always be of at least a certain height. So I want my, my minimum size for my row, we'll call it 30 VH to have a decent height on those, 30 viewport units tall. And then I want my max to be 1 FR. And that's only going to affect the first row. Every row after that has no template declaration. They're automatically added. So we need to add a second row declaration here. Min max 30 VH comma 1 FR. You could also use that repeat value, repeat 2 min max 30 VH 1 FR, and you get the same kind of idea here. So again, let's refresh this page over here, see what we have done to our grid in our inspector tools. And you can see we now have 2 evenly sized rows that are going to be filling and fitting that space here. So what I want to do is I want to have my first item span 2 rows. I want to actually take up vertical space in an asymmetry as well as horizontal space in an asymmetry. So we'll come back in and we will actually go into our children and we have a promo. So we've got promo, there's an nth child, actually we'll say promo that's a first child. So our first item in here, and we're going to tell it how many rows to span. So I have to give it a grid row declaration. So when we define out our template columns and our template rows, we use a plural with an S on the end. When I define it out in our children where they need to go, it's a singular. So grid row, and then we're going to use the line numbers that the browser gives us when we create this, because the browser actually numbers and names our lines for us. And in Firefox's inspector tools, you can see here we have the row line 1, row line 2, row line 3, column line 1, column line 2, 3, and 4. So 3 columns equals 4 grid lines. 2 rows equals 3 grid lines. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want our first promo to span from the first grid line to the third grid line. First row line to third row line. So I can come in and I can say, all right, grid row 1/3. And as you can see, it's kind of hard to tell. Let me put a background color on these promos real fast. Promo, background color, light blue. And let's give it a grid gap as well because I am slightly OCD about it. Grid gap 1.5 rem. There we go. So now you can see on the left-hand side, we have our first promo space taking up twice the height of the right-hand side. It's taking up 2 of those columns and the gap does not flow through. So this allows us not to have any weird clearing things, no margin bottom hacks or tricks. Everything is kind of first class in the design, in the code, ready to go. So I define that out, and then I also want my second item to have asymmetry across the x-axis. I want it to take up 2 columns. And so I can very easily come in here and I can say, all right, promo nth child 2. And again, you could set up separate classes for these if you want to, or if you're using a content management system, you could do that. For these simple demos, I like to do nth child, just so you know this is the second item in our markup. So I can specify grid column, just like I specified grid row, and set it up to be from grid line 2, which is that middle line, to grid line 4, which is our end line. So now, very, very quickly, in 17 lines of code, including our background color, which is not necessary for our layout, we now have an asymmetric grid where we've actually laid out our asymmetry inside of our template declaration. So instead of having to do hacks around our heights, hacks around our widths, inside of our markup, adding additional markup to do this, We're able to do it all with just a little bit of simple CSS and keep our promos as siblings, because they really, in this case, should be siblings in our markup. They shouldn't have additional wrappers placed on them just for our layout. Is that all making sense? Because I'm going to show us some fun naming conventions as well in a second. Let me know if things are still making sense to you, and if they are, we'll keep on moving. So while I wait for that, we're going to keep all these declarations, but I want to use a new segment of properties called named areas. Named lines, named areas. We're going to do named areas in this exercise. In the next exercise, we're going to talk about named lines. So I can specify a new declaration of grid template areas. And this is going to allow me to actually name my areas, and those areas will be allowed, those names will be allowed to be used in CSS. So what grid template areas does is it takes a set of quotation delimited strings that will represent our rows. So in this case, we've got 2 sets of quotation marks. They represent the 2 rows worth of cells. So we have, in our first row, we have 3 column cells, and so I can name them accordingly. I'm going to name my first one main, then give it a space, and that's going to represent the line that's in there. And then I'm going to give second and second. And what this is going to do is it's going to say, on my first row, have an area named main, a cell named main, and then 2 cells next to each other named second. And I'll be able to use that in my declaration. And then in my second set of quotation marks, and these don't have to be separated on lines, but as you're about to see, they do correspond to rows and columns, so it's a little bit easier to think about on separate lines. So it's just a mental model as opposed to worrying about figuring out where the lines go. So I'm going to have main be my first cell in this row, and that's going to allow my main item to span the two rows. And then I'm going to have a third area and a fourth area. And the number of spaces in between each of these sets of strings doesn't matter. And that's great because it means that I can line up my columns with each other. It makes it much easier to think about later on, 6 months down the road when you're coming back trying to figure out what you did. It makes it much easier to reason about, to think about, to remember. And that's what I'm kind of passionate about in this landscape, is not having to figure out what I was doing, what was in my brain at the time. Which is also why the line number declarations get a little wonky too. That's why I like to name things whenever I can. So now, instead of placing a grid row down here, I'm actually going to specify a grid area, and I'm going to use that reserved string that we had for our main area up in the grid template areas declaration as the grid area for this. And you'll notice there are no quotation marks around the string of main. It is now a reserved string. You can use it only for this. And so it's important to kind of keep that distinction. And then the same thing for our nth child 2. We'll do a grid area second. You can see it popped around in a weird way because I deleted the declaration and then I brought it back in. And then I actually, even though I don't need to do it, I do like to declare my promo nth child 3 and 4 so that I remember later on where everything is coming from. So you'll notice the grid automatically did that for us, and that's because grid is going to place content in the next available cell that it will fit in. So just by lucky happenstance, these 2 items, the last 2 promos, will fit automatically in those last 2 spots. But again, it's all about the future. It's all about future-proofing your code, not kicking yourself later on. So I just like to go ahead and declare it. It is unnecessary, but it can be helpful in more complex layouts. So we have an area called third, and we have an area called fourth. Grid area fourth. And now they all fit in there, and I'm going to show off the inspector tools again, because inspector tools also have the ability to display area names, which they're not right now for me. Come on, there we go. So as you can see here, since I have this box checked over in my inspector tools, you can see this area is named main, this area is named main, second, and third, and fourth. So it actually can overlay that on your content. It makes debugging these sorts of things way easier. This is why I use Firefox over Chrome for doing my layout work. It's just too handy to ignore. So we now have baked in our asymmetry into a grid. The other thing that I like to mention here is 1FR means that our rows, the 1FR declaration for our max size on our rows, that means that they're going to grow equally. So as I add space to this third promo here, I'm just going to copy and paste all this text. You don't need to do this in your example. But if I copied all this and gave it more text, and more text, and more text, there we go. You'll notice that the first row grows at the same rate. Now, for a lot of situations, this is ideal. I wanted a 50-50 split for our rows as well as for those kind of two big chunky columns. However, as you can see, if you are going to have clients that are going to be adding lots and lots of content here, it might be best to future-proof and not deal with a 50-50 split and instead have it be automatically sized rows based on its content. So instead of the 1FR unit, we can change these to the keyword auto, and the keyword auto is going to automatically size those rows based on its content. So because we have this one up here, let me see something real fast, save that in. Because we have all of this stuff on the left-hand side, it is trying to keep that kind of aspect ratio, but as we get bigger, it's not going to be nearly as big a deal. So you can see this one up here stays the same height, which is that 30 VH, right? So it's never going to get smaller than that. But the second row grows to extend however deep it needs to extend for the content. So again, depends on the design you're trying to make, but it's very important to think about what you're going to have happen there. And then depending on what the content is inside that, you're still going to have some sort of div probably that is flex or grid declared inside of it. So depending on what content you want in your promos, you can still have different types of layout mechanisms inside. Grid's only affecting the layout going back up. So I could very easily on our promo have each of our promos be display flex and have our align items property be center to center our headlines and our justify content to center our headlines. So we can still declare other layout types and other layout mechanisms inside of a grid item. It doesn't preclude that. These are all very cohesive, working together specifications. So this creates our asymmetric grid. And I want to go ahead and move on because we are now at 37 minutes, and I do want to make sure that I cover supports at the end and move us into our last exercise of today's workshop, which is creating what we call a full width breakout inside of an article, right? So what I mean by that is, let's assume, I'm going to do this real fast in kind of old school methodology, which should be our article body. We want to be a centered column of text that never gets outside of a certain width, right? A readable line length. So we can declare a max width on it. We'll call it, I don't know, 760 pixels just for now. And then we could have this with a margin left and right auto. And that's going to give us a centered column. It's a perfectly acceptable design pattern. We use it a lot in blog posts. We use it in a lot of different scenarios. It does go fluid when we get down to a certain period. But there are lots of great things that you can do by having items in your blog post break out and go full width. And if we wanted to do that in this case, we would have to do one of two things. We would have to change our markup. So we would add, we would finish our article body, start a breakout class, finish the breakout div, and then after that, start article body again, which isn't great semantically. It's not great for a lot of different reasons. It adds complexity to your code, all sorts of stuff that you don't want. The other way would be to work with negative margins. So negative margin left and right of a certain amount is going to stretch it out, and then you can put something inside of it that fits that space. Both of those, they're not hacks, right? They are working as intended, but they feel a little tricksy, right? They're tricksy hobbitses. So I like to think that this way is going to be a little bit closer to home. And I get to teach a couple different new properties in it as well, which I'm a fan of. So instead of doing all of this, on our article body, we want this to be a display grid as well. So we're going to change it over to a grid level context. And I want you to notice what's going to happen on this one, because it does have a little gotcha involved. So display grid, and our margins on the left-hand side changed. So we had paragraphs, right? We had headlines, and when I changed the context, we got more margins in between them. So let's go to the full page view and let's take a look at why that is. So let's inspect the page. We have each of these is a grid item. And then if we look in here, our H1 and our paragraph, they've got margin top and bottom, which is a default pattern in browsers. Unless you're using a reset or a normalize, you're going to start off with top and bottom margin. What browsers do usually in a normal block level context is what's called collapsing margins. So if you have a bottom margin that meets up against a top margin, the larger of the two will win and only have that amount of space. But when you display grid, when you change to a grid level context, margins no longer collapse. So what we got was actually our margin top and bottom intersecting and staying put and keeping their space. So it's a gotcha. When you change to display grid, you will get your margins no longer collapsing. So a default browser piece changes its own context when you change it over. So let's go ahead and go back on into our code. The next thing that I want to do is I want to define out some columns. Right? I'm going to start with 3 columns: a left-hand margin, a right-hand margin, and our center column. So we'll say display grid template columns. And I'm going to specify, we're just going to start with 3 1FRs, just so we can take a look at it real fast, see what's going to happen around this. So big things change, big things break, lots of fun going on here. So the next thing that we need to do is make sure that our content is always ever in that middle column. So as we learned in the placement exercise, in exercise 2, we can place these items in on a column line. So what we can do is we can say, all right, for anything inside of article body, so any direct descendant of article body, I'm using the universal CSS selector, the asterisk, and I'm using the direct descendant combinator, that greater than sign, to make sure that this only gets things that are direct descendants of article body. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a grid column declaration, and I'm going to start with just the number 2. So by default, grid column is 2 different values. It's the start line and the end line. So 2 says start at line number 2, and by default, grid will only take up 1 cell's worth of space. So this says go from line 2 to line 3, in other words, which is our middle column. So now that we've got a visual on the page, we can adjust our units to allow for this to be spaced better than it is right now. Right? So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change our middle column, and I'm going to give it a min-max, that same function that we had in both the previous versions. So min-max, and then inside of that, I'm going to give it a minimum character length and a maximum character length. And I'm going to use the ch unit in CSS. Any unit works here, right? You could do a percentage, you could do a hard-coded pixel value, you could do a VW, you could do anything that you need to. You could do a larger FR if you wanted to, all sorts of stuff like that. But I'm going to specify, we'll make sure that it maybe starts at 20 characters wide and then only extends to a readable line length of around maybe like 80 characters wide. So this way, what happens is we have what Jen Simmons, who's one of the great proponents of Grid, declared, I think pretty eloquently, variable squishiness in our responsive design. So our middle area has a hard squishy value, and our 2 columns on the outside have a much softer squishy value. They squish all the way into non-existence if there's no content inside of them. So if you're worried about having margins at mobile sizes, which I wouldn't blame you if you were, we can also exercise our min-max values on this as well and make sure that we always have maybe 1 rem's worth of space on each of these. So 1 rem, comma, it would help if I spelled max in there, 1 rem, comma, 1 FR, and the same for our right-hand column as well. This gives us 1 rem's worth of space. In this case, I think it's 16 pixels worth of space left and right. And you can adjust those values. You can even, usually you might want to start playing with CSS custom properties, a workshop for another day. to do some of this as well to make them easier to declare. But at this point, we now have a functioning middle column of text that has variable levels of squishiness depending on if there's content or not. So super handy here. But we're going to go ahead and dive into making the shorthand a little bit easier as well, because we want our full width area to not be in this column. And to do that, we have a full width class here. And I'm going to dive in. We're going to go ahead and declare that down here. And we're going to give this that same declaration, right? Grid column. And this is going to be from 1 to 4. So this ends up working out okay. It's not super complicated, but you might want to declare this in multiple ways, or you might want to extend this to maybe have an item that spans the left-hand side or the right-hand side. So we're going to experiment with the concept of named grid lines. So just like you have a named area, you can name specific lines. And so the first lines we're going to name are the lines surrounding our centered column. So we'll call this one article, or it could be content, or it could be column. Naming's the hardest thing in development, whatever you want to name it. And then we could have an end line over here, which is like end of article or something like that. But I don't want to then have to declare grid column article / end of article. So there's actually some syntactic sugar inside of the grid specification that looks at our declarations and looks to see if there's a dash start and a dash end. Oh, start and end. And then what I can do is when I declare my grid column, I can just use that new reserved string for grid column article. And our article items are now in that centered column in a more readable sense. And it also allows us to change it on the fly later on, which we'll see in a second. And the same thing can be done for our left and right hand edges as well. So I can come in and I can say, all right, we want a first line that is named full width, and a last line that is named full width end. Sorry, I should have a start on that full width up here. And then I can use that word, that keyword full width, down here in our class to have that full width area now take up that space. So that allows us to do a lot of different things. It allows us to also, if we want to have an element later on that spanned the left-hand edge, like from the left-hand edge of the browser to the right-hand edge of the story, let's add a new div up here, div class right side. This is a right side element. By default, it's going to appear right here in the flow. It doesn't break outside because we haven't told it to yet. Oops. And then I can declare that class down here and do a very similar thing. So we're going to say div class right side. And I could just have this be grid column full width. And that would give us a full width area. And maybe do something inside of it that would work out. We can do that. We get a full width area perfectly fine. Or I can come up and I can specify more named lines inside of my square brackets. So I can come in and I can say inside of my template column declaration, inside the first set of square brackets, that first line, which represents the left-hand side of the browser, put a space in there and say left start. And then after our article, where our article ends, we will have a left end as well. And this will have a left value for our grid. And let's give it a background color so we can see it a bit better. Tomato. And now it spans from the left-hand side of the browser to the right-hand side of our content column. Right? So that allows for us to have a left-hand side, a right-hand side, a full width, and a centered column, all with just declaring these value changes. And we could come in here, do the same thing with our start and end for a right-hand side. We could have right start on the article start and right end with our last line. And then if we wanted to change, for whatever reason, I named this right side and it's actually the left side. So if we wanted to change this, we could just change it to that value, and we now have a right aligned column or a right aligned area. It's always going to be in the flow of the document. It doesn't actually pull it outside the flow of the document. So this makes it very easy to move things around, shift on the fly. If you wanted to add some additional variable squishiness or add some additional columns in, you can just make sure that you keep your named lines in the right spot, and your elements will always kind of fit in the spot as they should. So I've got 10 minutes. I do want to cover some support topics about how we can support these things we've done today. I'm probably not going to be able to get through all 3, which is what I kind of had my fingers crossed on. But I can show it here, and we'll show it in the asymmetric grid as well. And I think that would be enough because it shows my idea around the methodology. So there's a website that is, do websites need to look the same in every browser.com? Oh, it's not that. It's been a while since I pulled it up. There it is. Do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser? It's a progressive enhancement website. It always says no. Even if you're in like Netscape Navigator, it will still say the word no. You won't get a lot of the fancy stuff, but you still get a functioning website. And so when I talk about supporting Grid, if you're still worrying about a small percentage of like IE 11 users, old Safari users, that sort of thing, I suggest that you look at the best that your content can look without Grid. And so it's a very progressive enhancement mindset, and we can use that using what's called feature queries in CSS. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you've heard of feature queries. I'm just curious. I won't wait on you because I have to keep moving so you can actually see it in action, but I'm curious. So all of this works if we have Grid, but it doesn't necessarily work if we don't have Grid. So when we look at this, if we didn't have Grid, let's just comment out display Grid, what we would get is something serviceable but not good, right? I would never say launch this to a client. Like, this is not where we want to be. So what if we had a starting point that looked great, and then what I like to call falls forward, not fall back, falls forward into Grid. So we can do that with support queries and with the Grid declaration. So first and foremost, I want to define out a good some thumbs up, some thumbs down. Coriano, I'll answer your question in a second. It's a good question. But let's look at this real fast. So if we have article body, and I'm going to comment out all of our Grid code right now so we can see our starting point. So we have an article body, and we're going to do that code that we wrote to begin with, right? Max width, I didn't like 760. We'll do, I don't know, 850 pixels. And we'll do margin left auto, margin right auto. Right? So what this is going to give us is a perfectly acceptable, perfectly readable, perfectly mobile-friendly column of content. And we don't necessarily need these breakout areas to be broken out. They look better broken out, but they don't look bad in the column. This is a fairly standard way to do it, right? This is not a big deal. If you wanted to go even further, you could do negative margins to make that work. I would never recommend going in and changing your markup for this, right? That's what support queries are all about, not changing your markup when you can. So I have this, and I can come into our code and uncomment out all this, and we have a problem now, right? We have this centered column. We still get our breakout spaces. They still work, but they only work inside of this centered column. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and put all this inside of a feature query. The syntax of a feature query, of course, is not at features. It is at supports, because we can't have it be easy on us. So at supports, and then a set of parentheses for what we're looking for in terms of the browser. This is very much like a feature or a media query, right? You put a condition inside of these parentheses. If it matches, run the code inside of it. So if it matches display grid, if a browser supports that property value pair, it's always property value, never one or the other, then run the code that's inside of it. So just to keep things clean, I'm going to bring all of this inside of it. You don't necessarily have to have it all inside, but it might behoove you to. And now we still have the same issue, so we need to do a reset inside of it as well. So I don't want this max width or the margins, and the margins don't necessarily matter, but the max width surely does, on the article body. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to say max width, and I think it takes a none value. None. And so that resets it. So now we have no max width set, and we move into a world where our grid code takes fully over. So again, we start with the support. We start with where we want old browsers to get, and then we fall forward into grid. Because as it turns out, and this is one of my favorite points about support queries, Internet Explorer 11 and Internet Explorer 10, two browsers that don't support grid, also don't support feature queries. But this code works because browsers, if they don't understand CSS, fail quietly. They just look at this block, say, I don't understand it, don't run it. And so we didn't want them to run this code anyway, so it works out perfectly that this support query works for us. More modern versions of Edge that don't support grid do support this, as well as some more modern versions of Firefox and some other stuff. But that is such a small use case, it's not a big deal. This also allows those browsers to get everything they need. So I've got a question from Coriano. Since one FR evenly spaces items within the grid, how would a grid with a repeat 3, 1 FR that already contains 3 items render 2 additional items in that grid? Would the third frame be empty? Yes. So unlike Flexbox, which would give you, if you specified a flex value of 1 on those, and they would evenly kind of stretch to fill that space, grid is a layout in mechanism. So if there's an empty cell in the grid, the browser doesn't care, right? The browser puts that empty cell on the page. It's expecting your content to flow into it. That can be beneficial because sometimes the way Flex grows things isn't what we want to do either, but it is a consideration whether you choose Flex or grid. If you were to do the repeat 3-1FR, and instead of 3-1FR did a auto fit and a min max, like we did in exercise number 1, you can do that inside of any container that you want. So that would allow you to have something that always had the right amount of space to fill it up. So the 1FR at that point would take over and stretch to fit. I'm going to keep going a little bit because I do want to show supporting in the asymmetric grid. But before anyone leaves, because I have to get back to work or anything like that, I do want to know your feedback on this Lunch and Learn. I want to know how much value you got out of it. I want to hear what could have gone better, what confused you. I want to hear, did it give you $3 worth of value? I want to know all these things. Hit me up on Twitter at brob, in the chat here. Send me an email, brian@codecontemporary.com. Go find a contact form on my site, Brian L. Robinson, whatever, right? Those links are kind of both in the frame of this. But let me know what you think, because I'm thinking about doing more of these. I like the value proposition. I want to know, so let me know. So I'm going to go ahead and go back onto our collection. And all this code, I'll leave this alone. You can just have it. It's yours. As the video should also stay up on YouTube after it's been processed by YouTube. So that's yours as well, and you're good to go. All right, so here we have the asymmetric promo. And as I stated in the should websites look exactly the same in every browser.com spiel, I don't necessarily think that this asymmetric promo is necessary on every single browser. It's going to be in 90-ish% of browsers, because if I go to caniuse.com and look up grid, you can see level 1 is supported in the US at this is in the US, at globally almost 92%. So that's quite a bit. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. You do want to look good in the browsers that doesn't support, though. You don't want to completely break and fall apart in that. But you can give them something that looks a little nicer than default, but maybe not quite as cool or as fancy as what they get in a more modern browser. Make sure it's fast, make sure it functions, and a user can use it. That's kind of my concern. So let's talk about what this could be if not an asymmetric browser. If we want to keep all 4 items at the top of the page, still give them some visual hierarchy, and do it in a way that we don't have to change our markup to accomplish. What can this be? For my money, and the way I usually teach this promo, is it can be a 2x2 grid. And that 2x2 grid gives us a very little bit of CSS that we have to write for our default position. So let's take a look at what that is. So instead of using grid on this, I'm going to use flex. So we're going to declare our banner again, And let me again comment out all of my promo code down here. So we are now back to our wonderful, wacky world of inline links. And yeah, be sure to also leave chat comments if you have questions. And I'll keep going for like 15, 20 minutes after I finish this exercise and answer any questions you've got as well. So be sure to leave them over there. Whether or not it covers things we covered today, I don't care. I'll answer whatever questions you've got in terms of grid and CSS and support and whatever else. All right, so class banner. I want this to be a flex context. So we say display flex, and we get more weird, wacky, wonderful things with flex this way. And then I want to add some widths and some values onto our promos, because again, flex works from content out. So we have to size our content to make it function in the way that we want it to. So we have a promo class, and we're going to give it each of our promos will get a width of 50%. And then you can see Flex is still trying to hammer all these into one row. So we have to have these wrap. So we'll say Flex, wrap, wrap. So now it's let me add a background color on here. Background color, tomato. Now we also need to accommodate those margins, right? The vertical and the horizontal margins. So I'm going to add a margin bottom to each of these of 1 rem. And then to handle that middle margin, I don't want to add margin right because that's going to frustrate me and have its own set of fun things, right? If I add margin right, I get that extra space on the right-hand side, and just like in old float-based layouts, I have to worry about that. So I don't want that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change our width to be a calc function in CSS, and that's going to do a calculation on the fly in the browser. And I want it to be 50% minus 0.5 rem. And that's going to equal 1 rem's worth of additional white space. And then I can use the justify content property from the box alignment module, justify content space between. And now we have this kind of symmetric promo, and we could very easily set a min height if we wanted to have some feature parity of like 30 VH, and we get something that is not as cool but still plenty good enough for our use case here. And the min height does the same thing, kind of as a min max of auto up to 1 FR. So in this case, all this is what we need, and we need to specify our fall forward state, right? So we're going to take all of this code that we wrote for our grid. I'm going to do the same thing that I did before, and you can see it's already wacky and crazy over there. Supports display grid, and bring all that inside of it. And then we have to fix some things, because that's really what support queries do. Feature queries do best is they allow you to do some fixing on the elements that you've got. So things that are happening here. Percentage-based widths are percentages of the parents in a block level element, right? So if you have a div, 50% will be 50% the width of the parent. But in grid, it's 50% of the grid area that it's within, which is super handy in a lot of ways, but not in this sense, right? It's kind of a problem here. You can see these are each 50% the width of the grid area they contain. So we need to do a reset on that. So I'm going to do my reset up here before my display grid. It doesn't matter where it goes, just to kind of keep things separated. So the first thing I need to do is make sure that my width goes back to 100%. And that's going to be 100% of the area of the promo, apologies, not the banner. The banner was already 100%. What happens when I haven't had quite enough caffeine in the morning before I do a live workshop? There we go. Width 100% gets us pretty close, but now if we look, we still have this margin bottom to contend with. And like I said before, margins don't collapse in grid. So in this case, we need to unset our margin bottom. So margin bottom goes back to 0. And technically, right, this 30 VH min height is still being set. And if you wanted to have your rows be different in terms of its min and max, so if you want this to be 20 instead, that height is going to be a problem. In our current use case, it doesn't do anything bad, but it could depending on the design that you want to do. So I'm going to also reset my height to be 100%, or auto again. It really doesn't matter. In this case, it's going to be good either way. So I reset to auto, and that lets the 30 VH minimum from our row sizing take back over. So now for browsers that don't support grid, they get a symmetric, functional, nice looking promotional space. But for browsers that do support grid, they get our asymmetric promos. So it allows us to fall forward into the cool and not worry about those old browsers nearly as much. It doesn't have to be pixel perfect. It doesn't have to be fully replicated. If you do have, I'm in a Slack group for the Jamstack, and they were having a conversation. A person in there had worked through an entire project and had been told IE11 was not a support issue. So they used a framework that had grid built into it pretty strongly. And then at the end, they found out that the Internet Explorer browser usage was at 60% for their browser. Not a great thing to realize at the end of the project, but what you can do is you can do some prefixing on that. It doesn't work great, but that's why I suggested to him. But what you can also just do is make sure that you've got these basics covered, and then for the 5%, maybe less, that most of us are dealing with on a regular basis, again, kind of looking at that can I use global statistic here, we're probably okay to kind of keep a basic level of support and then expand out. For this unfortunate soul, he's going to need to go pixel perfect, because 60% is that's just too much. But yeah, so definitely check out your own analytics for your client, for your company, whatever you're working on. Check your analytics, see how they're doing. Me personally, I'm at way above 92% for most of the projects I work on, because I cater to developers more often than not. So I get modern Chrome, modern Firefox more than anything else. But it's always important to check your support, check what you need to support, and go from there. Even though I don't support IE browsers all that much, I still make sure that I have these feature queries built in so that things are still nice when grid fails in a browser. So yeah, that's the basics of supporting in grid. We covered 3 different design patterns today. We learned about display grid, sets our context, template columns, grid template columns, grid template rows, sets up our rows and our columns. In the future, I'm thinking about doing an intermediate level course, and in that course, my plan would be to talk about the difference between the explicit grid, which is what we did today. We named our grid, we built our grid, we explicitly called it on the page, and the implicit grid, which is what the browser gives us by default, which you can do some stuff around as well. We set grid gaps, which allow for spacing in between the columns and the gaps, but allow for elements that span columns and gaps to span over them. Super handy. We created an asymmetric grid where we built our asymmetry into the grid declaration so that we don't have to worry about that. And that's super exciting to me as a designer, right? I'm a designer who codes. It's super exciting to me that I can actually codify in CSS my layout and not worry about it. And then we built out an article that has breakout spaces, left breakout, right breakout, full breakout, and we used named grid lines to do that. And we also, at that point, you could extend that and maybe code out, maybe as a next step for y'all to go work on your own in this full width area. Maybe put like a photo gallery and use grid and do like an asymmetric photo gallery. We've got a big image on the left-hand side, and then some small 4 tiny thumbnail columns on the right-hand side. That'd be really interesting. Kind of play with some ideas to take this into a more real-world context for you. So that's what I've got for you today. Again, I hope that this was a big help for you. I hope you start playing with grid, because it is something that you should be using right now. 92% globally. It's actually slightly higher usually in the US, so probably 93% in the US. And it just makes your life way easier, even though you still have to do a little extra work to support the older browsers. It's really worth it in the long run. You can do a lot of cooler things. If you're a developer and you work with a design team, definitely talk to them about grid, because there's a whole bunch of new stuff that we can do that they might not know about. They might still be thinking in a bootstrap methodology, especially since we hammer those constraints into them a lot. So let them know that some of the constraints, that we're loosening them a little bit, right? So definitely start thinking about that. Start playing with it more. Sit next to a designer and work with them a little bit. Say like, what would be cool? What could we do that's cool that you've never tried because we told you 12 column grid, 12 column grid. And see what they say, see what they help you build out. I think it's really interesting, the intersection that Grid gives us between designers and developers. But yeah, leave feedback. I'm desperate to know exactly what you thought of it. There's also, there's an upsell. I don't exactly know how that works in terms of Podium, my host for my products. 50% off my Practical CSS Grid course. These 3 exercises are actually in that, so that's why I gave it a big hefty discount for you, but there's an additional 4 exercises, and I go through even more properties, even more examples, and at some point I want to get a full set of feature query up in there as well. So it's there, it's $15 instead of the $30 for y'all. If it didn't work with Podia for some reason, hit me up in a DM or something like that, and I'll send you a code to get 50% off of it. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. And we'll see you either next time or just on the internet. Thanks, y'all.